Hello and welcome back. So we've introduced utilitarianism, which again is a very popular ethical theory, still has many adherents. And then we considered some problems with utilitarianism. So now I want to discuss utilitarianism according to John Stuart Mill, who is often considered sort of the inventor of it. And I've assigned you the some actual reading by the actual original philosopher here, and so I want to delve into this. This is an opportunity if you choose to write a paper on more of a historical approach to philosophy, which people often do, right? They'll just take a particular historical author and maybe argue that author is misinterpreted and there's a better interpretation going on. I want to delve into the original text here a bit. So the way Mill approaches it, right, I mean, the first thing he deals with is something that we didn't even bother to consider, but it must have been a more important issue in his time, and maybe it occurred to some of you as well. It's not totally foreign in our time. So, utilitarianism involves the word utility, and that might bring up some connotations that are actually not helpful for understanding what utilitarianism is. So, sometimes in everyday speech, when we talk about something being utilitarian, we mean it's like practical and like no frills, something like that, right? So, if I drink protein shakes every day instead of like a fancy meal, you could say, oh, that's sort of a utilitarian thing. I'm just getting my calories and my nutrients in, just purely practical and not about pleasure at all, right? But that's sort of the opposite of how Mill is using the terms utilitarian. Again, for the utilitarian, pleasure is the ultimate value, right? Along with he just wants to clarify that off the bat that sometimes we use utilitarian to mean practical stuff. Here he means it's a so here's some sort of slightly longer quotes from Mill, um, but I think they're useful uh, because they represent first of all his definition of utilitarianism and then his argument for utilitarianism. First quote, here's him defining what he means by utilitarianism. It's quote, the creed which accepts as the foundation of morals utility or the greatest happiness principle holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness and wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. Here you'll recall that I defined utilitarianism as hedonistic act consequentialism. That's exactly what Mill's saying here in slightly more, you know, words, right? But he does say, look, their actions, right, are the things that are right or wrong. He says they're right in proportion as they tend to promote certain things, right? So it's their tendency to create certain consequences that make an action right or wrong. And the thing, right, the consequences that we care about are happiness and unhappiness, which he defines as right pleasure and so this is entirely consistent with what we've seen so far. Um, it's just it's useful to see Mill say it in his own words. Um, and shortly after that follows, and the whole reading is fairly short, but shortly after he defines utilitarianism, he kind of then gives the entire argument for it. And the argument goes like this. The theory of life on which this theory of morality is grounded, namely that pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends, right? And that all desirable things, which are as numerous in the utilitarian as in any other scheme, are desirable either for the pleasure inherent in themselves or as the means to the promotion of pleasure and the prevention of pain. I mean, this might seem a little confusing, again, the syntax. It sometimes is especially confusing when the original author is writing in English, so no one feels the need to translate it, right? But it's the English of a couple centuries ago, almost. But he's saying the same thing we said, or the same argument I gave you, which is that here, the only things desirable as ends, the only thing that are values in themselves are right. And so all the other things that we're seeking, all the other things that we decide we should do, ultimately we're doing for the sake of generating pleasure for ourselves and other people and preventing pain, right? Making the exact same argument. Pain and pleasure are the ultimate values. So that was a very short argument, right? And if he stopped there, it would be a very short article. Um, and again, this is the argument, right? Anything we do is ultimately aimed at pleasure. And but instead of stopping there, right, he goes on to consider objections to utilitarianism. That's what you'll find the bulk of the article is about, is considering and responding objections to utilitarianism. And he considers some different ones than we saw in the last lecture. So it's worth looking at these. So the first one he considers, and this is not one that we've seen, uh, is known as the swine objection. So Mill considers the objection that uh, by making pleasure the ultimate value in life, the ultimate end that everything is aimed at, uh, that makes that sort of approach to ethics is, quote, a doctrine worthy only of swine. So what could that mean exactly? Well, it seems to be something like this. Look, even pigs can experience pleasure and pain. So if human ethics, right, with the seemingly lofty kind of endeavor of morality, uh, is really just pleasure seeking, well, you think, well, pigs can do that too. So is human morality sort of equivalent to pig morality, right? Is there anything special about ethics for humans, or is it just the same sort of thing that applies to pigs? Now, there's a couple ways you could go there, and we're actually going to see two different approaches, right? So Mill says, no, 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 there is something special about morality. We're not equivalent to pigs. And then he goes about attempting to show why utilitarianism is compatible with the sort of special status, a more elevated status for human morality. We'll see another more contemporary philosopher, Peter Singer, who takes the opposite approach, and he just accepts that process. And he says, yeah, human morality is nothing special, right? The same moral rules apply to humans and pigs and anything else. Anything that can feel pleasure and pain is worthy of moral consideration, right? But for now, let's stick with Mill, right? And Mill wants to say, no, there is a distinction, right? Just because pigs can feel pleasure and pain, human morality can still be somehow more elevated or distinct, right? So what Mill says, or what Mill does to attempt to distinguish morality for humans from morality for pigs, is that to say that humans are capable of higher pleasures that pigs are not capable of, right? And so, right, when even if we reduce human morality to pleasure, we're talking, in the case of humans, many of these kinds of pleasure are just not attainable by pigs, right? So we're talking about different, very special things. Presumably, he means things like, looking at great art, going and looking at the Mona Lisa, and appreciating it and get the pleasure of that beautiful work of art. Doing philosophy, right? And getting the pleasure of having a great idea for your paper and working it out and feeling that whole process can be pleasurable. I promise you, right? Even if it doesn't feel like it now. Um, Pigs can't do that, right? Look, those sorts of pleasures are just greater, right, than the pig pleasures. So human morality, even though it is based in pleasure, is a different sort of thing. Animals can't. But there's a question here about exactly what he could mean by a higher pleasure, right? So he says humans are capable of higher pleasures, and sure, pigs aren't capable of appreciating the Mona Lisa, but humans are. But in what way is it higher, right? Is it just more pleasure, right? Because if that's the case, then there might be a worry there, right? So let's suppose, pigs enjoy rolling in the mud, right? And I enjoy looking at the Mona Lisa, but maybe Mill's saying there's nothing in principle different. It's just that, if a pig rolling in mud is like 5 points of pleasure or whatever, looking at the Mona Lisa is 100, uh, points of that much more pleasurable. But this pleasure is the same, whether it's human pleasure. Well, if that's the case, then it's not clear why, human pleasure should be so special, or that human morality should be, on another plane than animal morality if it's just a matter of numbers, right? Because, it would only take 20 pigs rolling in the mud, right, to equal my pleasure in the Mona Lisa, and it just doesn't seem like there's much of a distinction there to be made if it's just a quantity of pleasure. Well, it's not just pure quantity. Maybe he means there's a qualitative distinction. between the sorts of higher pleasures humans can enjoy and the sorts of pleasures pigs can enjoy. Um, if that's what he means, it's not clear what that could mean, right? Are they both pleasure? Right? So if one is a different, again, if the two pleasures are qualitatively different and not comparable, then in virtue of what are they both pleasure, right? So he seems to want to have his cake and eat it too here, where he says, um, rolling in the mud produces pleasure, like viewing the Mona Lisa produces pleasure, and they're both pleasure, but the Mona Lisa kind is also totally different from the rolling in the mud kind, right? And they can't even be compared. Well, and if they're so different, how are they both pleasure? So he just doesn't really give us an answer to that. He doesn't really flesh out what it means to be a higher pleasure. It can't just be a matter of quantity, but if it's a matter of quality, it's not clear how he can square that and make them both pleasure and yet totally quality. He says a few things about it. Um, he says, for example, that um, maybe if he, even if you can't offer a theory of what makes the pleasures different, he says, if you've ever experienced both, you will know, right? If you've ever, experienced eating food, which is something pigs can do, and experienced looking at the Mona Lisa, you will agree, well, yeah, looking at the Mona Lisa is far better, right? And he thinks anyone who's ever seen the Mona Lisa will agree. Ah, yes, qualitatively a different sort of pleasure and much better than anything a pig could experience. Um, he says, quote, it's better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. It seems like the types of pleasures accessible to humans are just in another sort of galaxy than the sorts of pleasures accessible to pigs. Maybe, right? But it seems like there's some holes there that could be maybe for a paper topic. I mean, and you might even worry about that claim where he says, "Oh yeah, anyone who's seen the Mona Lisa will agree it's so much pleasurable than eating a Snickers bar or a sandwich." Well, I mean, if you take a poll, right, some people will prefer the Mona Lisa, but lots of people just maybe aren't artistically inclined and will look at right the Mona Lisa and be like, I'd kind of rather have a burger, right? Um, so it's not clear that his claim that everyone will agree on what are the higher pleasures is necessarily true. It seems like a lot of people disagree. And you know, lots of people forego greater pleasures for lower ones, right? People sleep in rather than read philosophy and so on. Now Mill's aware of this, right? He's a human and he's experienced it. He says, look, that's not people disagreeing about what is the greater pleasure, right? They'll agree, okay, I really should be reading my philosophy. That would be more pleasurable, but I just got kind of a weakness of will and I'm sleeping in instead, right? I'm just a little late. He thinks that we would all agree. Again, I think that's an open question, right? And he also claims that, people who, prefer to whatever, sit around and whatever, smoke cigarettes instead of eat healthy, even though, ultimately it'd be more pleasurable if you ate healthy and stopped smoking. Um, he says he says eventually you can get into these bad habits where you choose the lower pleasure over and over again, and then you sort of like give yourself brain damage where you can't even appreciate the higher pleasures anymore, right? You just sort of degrade your own sensibilities. Right? Um, so he has something to say, right, in response to the swine objection. It's not the only response you could have to the swine objection, but I think he needs a little help fleshing it out. And I think this is an opportunity for someone to write a paper to sort out what Mill's saying. Maybe come to Mill's defense and say, yes, his distinction between higher and lower pleasures can be made consistent. Right? We have to do a little, a textual analysis of his writing and fill in some blanks for it. Be interesting for you to write. So there are some other sort of different sorts of objections that Mill considers. So, he said that utilitarianism um, obeys the greatest happiness principle, which says the right action is the one that produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number, right? And who's included in that greatest net happiness? Well, any creature that can experience pain or pleasure, right? Any sentient being, at least according to, you know, it's not 100% clear what Mill means by sentient. It's much more clear in contemporary philosophers who interpret that as saying, yeah, any creature that can feel pain and pleasure, right? Dog here would count. That dog's pain and pleasure would count morally, even if that dog doesn't have language and maybe can't do any sort of logics or whatever, more reasoning. Um, so uh, let's presume that that's what Mill means for now, right? So after sort of explaining that, the greatest happiness principle, um, he goes on to consider the possible objection that true happiness is just never available, right? Um, you might think, maybe if you're of a particular religious view, right, like happiness on this earth, right, will never exist, right? The only true happiness is maybe being in heaven or something like that. And earth is just a vale of tears. There is no happiness. Um, if that's the case, right, if there's no real happiness to be had in our earthly existence, then utilitarianism would seem pointless. But Mill says, well, you know, that's all going to depend on what you mean by happy, right? If what you're looking for is constant ecstasy, right, then yeah, probably no human gets that, right? At least in this life. But he says that's not what I'm talking about when I talk about happiness, right? He says utilitarianism only means, sometimes you feel happy, right? Like sometimes you feel good. If people are to be trusted when they talk about their experience, they sometimes say, yes, I'm happy right now, or that was a happy time, right? So it seems like there are at least moments of happiness. And the point of utilitarianism is just to maximize those moments, right? It doesn't require perfect ending happiness. Most that humans can get. Again, the person that Mill is sort of imagine he's arguing with might say, well, just little moments of pleasure, right? In a overall kind of like, you know, uh, bad existence. What's even the point of that, right? And Mill will say, I don't know, people seem to get by, right? People live their lives with whatever pleasure they can scrape together. Um, and they seem to live their lives. And if you ask them, many of them say, yeah, it's fine. I'm happy enough, right? I could be better. So he says, yeah, my point is just like, couldn't we do a little more to give them a little more, right? That seems to be the basis of morality for Mill. It doesn't require some sort of happiness or, you know, the the objector he's imagining here. He thinks his standards for happiness are just a bit too high. Another possible objection, right? So if utilitarianism is correct, then again, morality is just about producing pleasure for yourself, for others, right? But it seems like some of the models of morality, Jesus, for instance, uh, are all about sacrifice, right? Self-sacrifice. And, Jesus on the cross is like held up as sort of a model of morality. And it's not just Jesus, the Buddha, Gandhi, if you look through the religious and spiritual literatures, seems like there's a lot of glorification of suffering, right? Um, So, Mill, how can you make sense of this, right? That often our models of morality are people who suffer. And Mill says, he says, look, yes, that's true, right? Jesus is held up as a model of morality, but only because he's suffering for the sake of pleasure for other people, right? Again, the martyr um, suffers, right? They experience own pain and forgo their own pleasure, but the goal in each case is meant to be greater pleasure for the rest of humanity, right? If Jesus had just been suffering for no reason, right, had just chosen, right, to suffer and to be crucified, but there was nothing was supposed to have been gained for that for anyone else, then that wouldn't be martyrdom. That would be just foolishness, right? So the whole point of the martyr is not the suffering per se. It's again the greater pleasure that will be produced through the suffering. So Mill thinks that utilitarianism is perfectly compatible with glorifying martyrs. They're foregoing their own pleasure to generate much more pleasure for other people. That's totally a utilitarian thing. Mill touches on the utilitarianism as too demanding, right? But in a different form than the one we saw. So the objection Mill considers here is whether it's realistic um, to say that people are motivated by the pleasure of the whole world every time they make a decision, right? Is that a realistic sort of psychological account of how people make moral decisions, right? Are they always thinking, if I do this thing, what will the net pleasure be for the entire universe? Cuomo says no. Obviously, people aren't doing that, right? people have all types of motivations for their actions, right? But utilitarianism is not an account of moral psychology. It's an account of like the metaphysics of morals, right? So whatever your motivations might be, and again, utilitarianism doesn't even care about your motivation. It just cares about the consequences of your action. So uh, be motivated by whatever you want, right? But if your action produces more pleasure than pain, that will be a good thing, right? Regardless of what was going on in your head when you did the thing, right? So again, um, and he also thinks that you have a fair amount of leeway here, right? So um, he doesn't think every decision is going to have a great moral weight, right? So, you know, if I'm trying to decide, put aside the issue of like whether eating meat is good for humanity. There are probably environmental issues and the suffering of animals. But let's suppose that I'm already committed to eating meat. My only choice right now is like, should I have a burger or a taco, right? Um, Mill says that's not really a moral decision. There's not going to be a big effect either way, right? Don't worry. You don't have to, every single thing you do, you don't have to worry about how it's going to benefit humanity. Um, most of your decisions are like that. Not too demanding in that way. So I said again, right? Utilitarianism doesn't care about your motivations. It's not an account of moral psychology. Um, and most of the time, the effects of your decisions don't ripple outward towards right the entire universe in any serious way, right? Most of the times, the effects of what you do, they matter for the people that are close to you in your life, right? Um, if I decide, whatever, not to go to work one day and you folks miss a lecture, maybe that'll be bad for you and maybe it could affect your grade a little bit or maybe not, right? But I don't have to worry about whether it's gonna, what about people in Russia? Is my not going to work gonna ultimately somehow create some pain for someone in Russia? Says, no, you're not that important, right? So again, utilitarianism is not super demanding. You don't really have to try and calculate net happiness for every person in the universe. You can just think about the people that are going to be immediately affected by your actions, and so a similar objection, right? That again questions like motivations or how motivations factor into ethical decisions. Um, is that it might seem that making moral decisions on the basis of calculating total right pain and pleasure whole world feels a little cold and unemotional, right? Um, we might think that our moral action should be based on moral feelings, right? So if I do, again, if I give to charity, we would think, oh, it's because I'm overwhelmed, right, with care, right, for these people that are suffering, and so I say yes, I must give them money. I feel so bad for them, right, or something like that. Um, and Mill just here bites the bullet, right? And biting the bullet just means sort of standing your ground and saying, maybe this sounds a little weird, right? But it's actually right, and just get used to it, right? So Mill says, no, your motivations are not relevant, right? Someone who gives money, right, to the poor out of trying to look good versus somebody who gives money to the poor because they're really moved by the suffering of the poor. It's the exact same type of action, right? Exact same moral status for those. Motivations just don't matter. That might feel, right, a little weird, right, to you, but again, that's no ethical theory we'll find going to sit right with you in every single area. So every ethical theory at some point is going to say, I know this feels a little unintuitive, but I'm going to bite the bullet and put my foot down, even though it might feel weird to you. So you always have that option, right? As an ethical theorist, you always have that option in your paper, right? If you find that the view you're arguing for has a kind of unintuitive consequence, you can always say, look, I know this is unintuitive, but I'm going to bite the bullet here. Nonetheless, I'm correct. So that's what Mill's doing here. He's saying, no, motivations don't matter. Another objection he considers is, you know, remember the time he's writing there in the 1800s, and his view of morality doesn't mention God at all, right? Does that mean that utilitarianism is a godless doctrine, and is that a bad thing? Um, well, again, at the time Mill was writing, he would like to be compatible with Christianity, right? Because you can hard to get a job if you uh, pretend to be a Christian at this time, right? And he probably was sincerely a Christian, but he says, look, utilitarianism is totally compatible with religion, right? Because we believe in a benevolent God that wants his creatures to be happy, right? So this is totally what utilitarianism is all about, right? Yeah, we want all of God's creatures to be as happy as possible. Now, here's another objection that Mill considers as one that I often see coming from students, and I like to resist it. I don't typically I discourage people from writing like a this up as a paper where people say, well, it's just kind of impossible to do the math for utilitarianism. Like, okay, should I drive to work today? What do I have to like calculate? Because carbon emissions, is that going to cause anybody some pain, in the future in 100 years? Well, what's the probability that I might get in an accident and that would cause me pain and other people pain? Um, and then, but I also have to consider the happiness of the people who benefit from me doing the job and the happiness I get from getting paid. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of factors, right? And some of them are uncertain, and you have to sort of base your judgment on probabilities, right? Um, and if you're thinking about whether they ripple out further and further into the future and wider, um, you may end up with a literally infinite number of consequences, right? So it might seem like it's impossible to live that way, to really be a utilitarian. But Mill says, fortunately, we don't have to do these calculations, right, very often. Maybe in some tricky situations, it's worth getting out pen and paper. Because the past generations and the experience, right, of our parents and grandparents and so on into the past have sort of done the calculations. Past generations of humans have tried out all sorts of actions, right? And they found out whether they ended up being painful on the whole or pleasurable on the whole. And they've sort of distilled all that knowledge and that information in, some things that we recognize as traditional moral rules, right? So the reason that your parents told you you shouldn't lie and you shouldn't steal is because they picked up that information from their parents and their parents' parents that, yeah, on the whole, typically lying causes more pain than pleasure. On the whole, typically stealing causes more pain than pleasure. And the vast majority of your decisions every day, you can just use those rules, right? Maybe once in a while there'll be a tricky situation. Oh, should I lie to save a life, right? Okay, if you ever find yourself in that situation, then by all means, take a break and do the utilitarian calculation, right? That's pretty rare, right? Most of the time, yeah, you shouldn't lie. Most of the time, you shouldn't steal. So it's not so hard to be a utilitarian. Um, and finally, and this objection is a result of what was a good thing about utilitarianism, the flexibility, right? Um, we all recognize that sometimes moral rules have to be broken in certain situations. Sometimes, if you had to lie to save a life, most people would say, yeah, do that, right? Um, but that flexibility um, might come with problems, right? So Mill considers the objection that each person might sort of find reasons to do whatever they kind of wanted to do anyways, right? By sort of like adding up the pain and pleasure in a particular way, right? So someone might say, oh, I don't want to go to class today. Well, let me see. Let me add up the pain and pleasure. And you'll kind of stack the things and be like, well, I think probably nothing important will happen today anyways. And, I won't be missed. And, right, you can kind of invent what the consequences will be in sort of a disingenuous way to sort of justify whatever you want to do. And Mill says, well, sure, yeah, people can do that. Uh, but that's just being disingenuous, right? That's motivated reasoning, and utilitarianism doesn't tell you to do that. If people are going to misuse utilitarianism to bad ends, that's their problem. It's not a problem for utilitarianism, being disingenuous. So that, he thinks, doesn't sort of undermine the general good thing about the flexibility, right? That allows you to say, okay, yeah, you shouldn't kill except in self-defense, or except to, or something like that. So Um, Utilitarianism doesn't have to make all these ad hoc exceptions. Thou shalt not kill. Well, yeah, except, save 1,000 children. Right? It doesn't have to make those exceptions, right? The flexibility is built into the utilitarian calculus, right? And it's always going to, he thinks, be the right answer in every tricky. Right, so that's Mill. Next lecture we'll cover Singer, who's a more contemporary utilitarian philosopher who uses utilitarianism to argue for animal rights.